Chapter 13, The Business Cycle. Interventionism and Economic Analysis. Number 2, Credit Expansion. It is a fundamental fact of human behavior that people value present goods higher than future goods. An apple available for immediate consumption is valued higher than an apple which will be available next year. And an apple which will be available in a year is in turn valued higher than an apple which will become available in 5 years. This difference in valuation appears in the market economy in the form of the discount, to which future goods are subject, as compared to present goods. In money transactions, this discount is called interest. Interest, therefore, cannot be abolished. In order to do away with interest, we would have to prevent people from valuing a house, which today is habitable, more highly than a house which will not be ready for use for 10 years. Interest is not peculiar to the capitalistic system only. In a socialist community, too, the fact will have to be considered that a loaf of bread, which will not be ready for consumption for another year, does not satisfy present hunger. Interest does not have its origin in the meeting of supply and demand of money loans in the capital market. It is rather the function of the loan market, which in business terms is called the money market for short-term credit and the capital market for long-term credit, to adjust the interest rates for loans transacted in money to the difference in the valuation of present and future goods. This difference in valuation is the real source of interest. An increase in the quantity of money, no matter how large, cannot in the long run influence the rate of interest. No other economic law is less popular than this, that interest rates are in the long run independent of the quantity of money. Public opinion is reluctant to recognize interest as a market phenomenon. Interest is thought to be an evil, an obstacle to human welfare, and therefore it is demanded that it be eliminated or at least considerably reduced. And credit expansion is considered the proper means to bring about easy money. There is no doubt that credit expansion leads to a reduction of the interest rate in the short run. At the beginning, the additional supply of credit forces the interest rate for money loans below the point which it would have in an unmanipulated market. But it is equally clear that even the greatest expansion of credit cannot change the difference in the valuation of future and present goods. The interest rate must ultimately return to the point at which it corresponds to this difference in the valuation of goods. The description of this process of adjustment is the task of that part of economics which is called the theory of the business cycle. At every constellation of prices, wages, and interest rates, there are projects which will not be carried out because a calculation of their profitability shows that there is no chance for the success of such undertakings. The businessman does not have the courage to start the enterprise because his calculations convince him that he will not gain but will lose by it. This unattractiveness of the project is not a consequence of money or credit conditions. It is due to the scarcity of economic goods and labor, and to the fact that they have to be devoted to more urgent and therefore more attractive uses. When the interest rate is artificially lowered by credit expansion, the false impression is created that enterprises, which previously had been regarded as unprofitable, now become profitable. Easy money induces the entrepreneurs to embark upon business which they would not have undertaken at a higher interest rate. With the money borrowed from the banks, they enter the market with additional demand and cause a rise in wages and in the prices of the means of production. This boom, of course, would have to collapse immediately in the absence of further credit expansion, because these price increases would make the new enterprises appear unprofitable again. But if the banks continue with the credit expansion, this brake fails to work. The boom continues. But the boom cannot continue indefinitely. There are two alternatives. Either the banks continue the credit expansion without restriction and thus cause constantly mounting price increases and an ever-growing orgy of speculation, which, as in all other cases of unlimited inflation, ends in a crack-up boom and in a collapse of the money and credit system. Or the banks stop before this point is reached, voluntarily renounce further credit expansion, and thus bring about the crisis. The depression follows in both instances. It is obvious that a mere banking process like credit expansion cannot create more goods and wealth. What the credit expansion actually accomplishes is to introduce a source of error in the calculations of the entrepreneurs and thus causes them to misjudge business and investment projects. The entrepreneurs act as if more producers' goods were available than are actually at hand. They plan expansion of production on a scale for which the available quantities of producers' goods are not sufficient. These plans are bound to fail because of the deficiency in the available amount of producers' goods. The result is that there are plants which cannot be used because the complementary facilities are lacking. There are plants which cannot be completed. There are other plants again whose products cannot be sold because consumers desire other products more urgently, which cannot be produced in sufficient quantities because the necessary productive facilities are not ready. The boom is not overinvestment, it is misdirected investment. It is frequently argued against this conclusion that it would hold true only if at the beginning of the credit expansion there were neither unused capacity nor unemployment. If there were unemployment and idle capacity, things would be different, they claim. But these assumptions do not affect the argument. The fact that a part of the productive capacity which cannot be diverted to other uses is unused is the consequence of errors of the past. Investments were made in the past under assumptions which proved to be incorrect. The market now demands something else than what can be produced by these facilities. The accumulation of inventories is speculation. The owner does not want to sell the goods at the current market price because he hopes to realize a higher price at a future date. Unemployment of workers is also an aspect of speculation. The worker does not want to change his location or occupation, nor does he want to lower his wage demands because he hopes to find the work he prefers, at the place he prefers, and at higher wages. Both the owners of merchandise and the unemployed refuse to adjust themselves to market conditions because they hope for new data which would change market conditions to their advantage. Because they do not make the necessary adjustments, the economic system cannot reach equilibrium. In the opinion of the advocates of credit expansion, what is necessary fully to utilize the unused capacity, to sell the supply at prices acceptable to the owners, and to enable the unemployed to find work at wages satisfactory to them, is merely additional credit, which such expansion could provide. This is the view which underlies all plans for pump priming. It would be correct for the stocks of goods and for the unemployed under two conditions. Number one, if the price rises caused by the additional quantity of money and credit would uniformly and simultaneously affect all other prices and wages. And number two, if the owners of the excessive supplies and the unemployed would not increase their prices and wage demands. This would cause the exchange ratios between these goods and services and other goods and services to change in the same way as they would have to be changed in the absence of credit expansion, by reducing the price and wage demands in order to find buyers and employers. The course of the boom is not any different because at its inception, there are unused productive capacity, unsold stocks of goods, and unemployed workers. We might assume, for instance, that we are dealing with copper mines, copper inventories, and copper miners. The price of copper is at a point at which a number of mines cannot profitably continue their production. Their workers must remain idle if they do not want to change jobs, and the owners of the copper stocks can only sell part of it if they are unwilling to accept a lower price. What is needed to put the idle mines and miners back to work and to dispose of the copper supply without a price drop is an increase, P, in producers' goods in general, which would permit an expansion of overall production so that an increase in the price, sales, and production of copper would follow. If this increase, P, does not occur, but the entrepreneurs are induced by credit expansion to act as if it had occurred, the effect on the copper market will first be the same as if P actually had appeared. But everything that has been said before of the effects of credit expansion develops in this case as well. The sole difference is that misdirected capital investment, as far as copper is concerned, does not necessitate the withdrawal of capital and labor from other branches of production, which under existing conditions are considered more important by the consumers. But this is only due to the fact that, as far as copper is concerned, the credit expansion boom impinges upon previously misdirected capital and labor, which have not yet been adjusted by the normal corrective processes of the price mechanism. The true meaning of the argument of unused capacity, unsold, or as it is said inaccurately, unsaleable inventories, and idle labor now becomes apparent. The beginning of every credit expansion encounters such remnants of older, misdirected capital investments and apparently corrects them. In actuality, it does nothing but disturb the workings of the adjustment process. The existence of unused means of production does not invalidate the conclusions of the monetary theory of the business cycle. The advocates of credit expansion are mistaken when they believe that, in view of unused means of production, the suppression of all possibilities of credit expansion would perpetuate the depression. The measures they propose would not perpetuate real prosperity, but would constantly interfere with the process of readjustment and the return of normal conditions. It is impossible to explain the cyclical changes of business on any basis other than the theory which commonly is referred to as the monetary theory of the business cycle. Even those economists who refuse to recognize in the monetary theory the proper explanation of the business cycle have never attempted to deny the validity of its conclusions about the effects of credit expansion. In order to defend their theories about the business cycle, which differ from the monetary theory, they still have to admit that the upswing cannot occur without simultaneous credit expansion, and that the end of the credit expansion also marks the turning point of the cycle. The opponents of the monetary theory actually confine themselves to the assertion that the upswing of the cycle is not caused by credit expansion, but by other factors, and that the credit expansion, without which the upswing would be impossible, is not the result of a policy intended to lower the interest rate and to invite the execution of additional business plans, but that it is released somehow by conditions leading to the upswing without intervention by the banks or by the authorities. It has been asserted that the credit expansion is released by the rise in the rate of interest through the failure of the banks to raise their interest rates in accordance with the rise in the natural rate. This argument, too, misses the main point of the monetary theory of the cycle. Whether the credit expansion gets underway because the banks ease credit terms or because they fail to stiffen the terms in accordance with changed market conditions is of minor importance. Decisive only is the fact that there is credit expansion because there exists institutions which consider it their task to influence interest rates by the granting of additional credit. Whoever believes that credit expansion is a necessary factor in the movement which forces the economy into the upswing, which must be followed by a crisis and depression, would have to admit that the surest means to achieve a cycle-proof economic system lies in preventing credit expansion. But despite the general agreement that measures should be taken to smooth the wave-like movements of the cycle, measures to prevent credit expansion do not receive consideration. Business cycle policy is given the task to perpetuate the upswing created by the credit expansion and yet to prevent the breakdown. Proposals to prevent credit expansion are refuted because supposedly they would perpetuate the depression. Nothing could be a more convincing proof of the theory which explains the business cycle as originating from interventions in favor of easy money than the obstinate refusal to abandon credit expansion. One would have to ignore all facts of recent economic history were one to deny that measures to lower rates are considered desirable and that credit expansion is regarded as the most reliable means to achieve the same. The fact that the smooth functioning and the development and steady progress of the economy is over and over again disturbed by artificial booms and ensuing depressions is not a necessary characteristic of the market economy. It is rather the inevitable consequence of repeated interventions which intend to create easy money by credit expansion. The Causes of the Economic Crisis and Other Essays Before and After the Great Depression. Monetary Stabilization and Cyclical Policy. Number 1. The Banking School Fallacy. If notes are issued by the banks, or if bank deposits subject to check or other claim are opened, in excess of the amount of money kept in the vaults as cover, the effect on prices is similar to that obtained by an increase in the quantity of money. Since these fiduciary media, as notes and bank deposits not backed by metal are called, render the service of money as safe and generally accepted, payable on demand monetary claims, they may be used as money in all transactions. On that account, they are genuine money substitutes. Since they are in excess of the given total quantity of money in the narrower sense, they represent an increase in the quantity of money in the broader sense. The practical significance of these undisputed and indisputable conclusions in the formation of prices is denied by the banking school with its contention that the issue of such fiduciary media is strictly limited by the demand for money in the economy. The banking school doctrine maintains that if fiduciary media are issued by the banks only to discount short-term commodity bills, then no more would come into circulation than were needed to liquidate the transactions. According to this doctrine, bank management could exert no influence on the volume of the commodity transactions activated. Purchases and sales from which short-term commodity bills originate would, by this very transaction, already have brought into existence paper credit, which can be used, through further negotiation, for the exchange of goods and services. If the bank discounts the bill and, let us say, issues notes against it, that is, according to the banking school, a neutral transaction as far as the market is concerned. Nothing more is involved than replacing one instrument which is technically less suitable for circulation, the bill of exchange, with a more suitable one, the note. Thus, according to the school, the effect of the issues of notes need not be to increase the quantity of money in circulation. If the bill of exchange is retired at maturity, then notes would flow back to the bank, and new notes could enter circulation again only when new commodity bills came into being once more as a result of new business. The weak link in this well-known line of reasoning lies in the assertion that the volume of transactions completed, as sales and purchases from which commodity bills can derive, is independent of the behavior of the banks. If the banks discount at a lower rather than at a higher interest rate, then more loans are made. Enterprises which are unprofitable at 5% and hence are not undertaken may be profitable at 4%. Therefore, by lowering the interest rate they charge, banks can intensify the demand for credit. Then, by satisfying this demand, they can increase the quantity of fiduciary media in circulation. Once this is recognized, the banking theory's only argument that prices are not influenced by the issue of fiduciary media collapses. One must be careful not to speak simply of the effects of credit in general on prices, but to specify clearly the effects of increased credit or credit expansion. A sharp distinction must be made between, number one, credit which a bank grants by lending its own funds or funds placed at its disposal by depositors, which we call commodity credit, and number two, that which is granted by the creation of fiduciary media, i.e. notes and deposits not covered by money, which we call circulation credit. It is only through the granting of circulation credit that the prices of all commodities and services are directly affected. If the banks grant circulation credit by discounting a 3-month bill of exchange, they exchange a future good, a claim payable in 3 months, for a present good that they produce out of nothing. It is not correct, therefore, to maintain that it is immaterial whether the bill of exchange is discounted by a bank of issue or whether it remains in circulation, passing from hand to hand. Whoever takes the bill of exchange in trade can do so only if he has the resources. But the bank of issue discounts by creating the necessary funds and putting them into circulation. To be sure, the fiduciary media flow back again to the bank at expiration of the note. If the bank does not give the fiduciary media out again, precisely the same consequences appear as those which come from a decrease in the quantity of money in its broader sense. Number two, early effects of credit expansion. The fact that in the regular course of banking operations, the banks issue fiduciary media only as loans to producers and merchants means that they are not used directly for purposes of consumption. Rather, these fiduciary media are used, first of all, for production. That is, to buy factors of production and pay wages. The first prices to rise, therefore, as a result of an increase of the quantity of money in the broader sense, caused by the issue of such fiduciary media, are those of raw materials, semi-manufactured products, other goods of higher orders and wage rates. Only later do the prices of goods of the first order, consumers' goods, follow. Changes in the purchasing power of a monetary unit brought about by the issue of fiduciary media follow a different path and have different accompanying social side effects from those produced by a new discovery of precious metals or by the issue of paper money. Still, in the last analysis, the effect on prices is similar in both instances. Changes in the purchasing power of the monetary unit do not directly affect the height of the rate of interest. An indirect influence on the height of the interest rate can take place as a result of the fact that shifts in wealth and income relationships appear as a result of the change in the value of the monetary unit, influence savings, and thus the accumulation of capital. If a depreciation of the monetary unit favors the wealthier members of society at the expense of the poorer, its effect will probably be an increase in capital accumulation, since the well-to-do are the more important savers. The more they put aside, the more their incomes and fortunes will grow. If monetary depreciation is brought about by an issue of fiduciary media, and if wage rates do not promptly follow the increase in commodity prices, then the decline in purchasing power will certainly make this effect much more severe. This is the forced savings which is quite properly stressed in recent literature. However, three things should not be forgotten. First, it is always dependent upon the data of the particular case, whether shifts of wealth and income, which lead to increased saving, are actually set in motion. Second, under circumstances which need not be discussed further here, by falsifying economic calculation based on monetary bookkeeping calculations, a very substantial devaluation can lead to capital consumption. Such a situation did take place temporarily during the recent inflationary period. Third, as advocates of inflation through credit expansion should observe, any legislative measure which transfers resources to the rich at the expense of the poor will also foster capital formation. Eventually, the issue of fiduciary media in such manner can also lead to increased capital accumulation within narrow limits and hence to a further reduction of the interest rate. In the beginning, however, an immediate and direct decrease in the loan rate appears with the issue of fiduciary media. But this immediate decrease in the loan rate is distinct in character and degree from the later reduction. The new funds offered on the money market by the banks must obviously bring pressure to bear on the rate of interest. The supply and demand for loan money were adjusted at the interest rate prevailing before the issue of any additional supply of fiduciary media. Additional loans can be placed only if the interest rate is lowered. Such loans are profitable for the banks because the increase in the supply of fiduciary media calls for no expenditure except for the mechanical costs of banking, i.e. printing the notes and bookkeeping. The banks can therefore undercut the interest rates which would otherwise appear on the loan market in the absence of their intervention. Since competition from them compels other money lenders to lower their interest charges, the market interest rate must therefore decline. But can this reduction be maintained? That is the problem. Number 3, inevitable effects of credit expansion on interest rates. In conformity with Wicksell's terminology, we shall use natural interest rate to describe that interest rate which would be established by supply and demand if real goods were loaned in natura, directly as in barter, without the intermediary of money. Money rate of interest will be used for that interest rate asked on loans made in money or money substitutes. Through continued expansion of fiduciary media, it is possible for the banks to force the money rate down to the actual cost of the banking operations. Practically speaking, that is almost to zero. As a result, several authors have concluded that interest could be completely abolished in this way. Whole schools of reformers have wanted to use banking policy to make credit gratuitous and thus to solve the social question. No reasoning person today, however, believes that interest can ever be abolished, nor doubts but what if the money interest rate is depressed by the expansion of fiduciary media. It must sooner or later revert once again to the natural interest rate. The question is only how this inevitable adjustment takes place. The answer to this will explain at the same time the fluctuations of the business cycle. The currency theory limited the problem too much. It only considered the situation that was of practical significance for the England of its time. That is, when the issue of fiduciary media is increased in one country while remaining unchanged in others. Under these assumptions, the situation is quite clear. General price increases at home, hence an increase in imports, a drop in commodity exports, and with this, as notes can circulate only within the country, an outflow of metallic money. To obtain metallic money for export, holders of notes present them for redemption. The metallic reserves of the banks decline, and consideration for their own solvency then forces them to restrict the credit offered. That is the instant at which the business upswing, brought about by the availability of easy credit, is demonstrated to be an illusory prosperity. An abrupt reaction sets in. the money rate of interest shoots up. Enterprises from which credit is withdrawn collapse and sweep along with them the banks which are their creditors. A long persisting period of business stagnation now follows. The banks, warned by this experience into observing restraint, not only no longer underbid the natural interest rate, but exercise extreme caution in granting credit. Number 4, the price premium. In order to complete this interpretation, we must, first of all, consider the price premium. As the banks start to expand the circulation credit, the anticipated upward movement of prices results in the appearance of a positive price premium. Even if the banks do not lower the actual interest rate anymore, the gap widens between the money interest rate and the natural interest rate, which would prevail in the absence of their intervention. Since loan money is now cheaper to acquire than circumstances warrant, entrepreneurial ambitions expand. New businesses are started in the expectation that the necessary capital can be secured by obtaining credit. To be sure, in the face of growing demand, the banks now raise the money interest rate. Still, they do not discontinue granting further credit. They expand the supply of fiduciary media issued, with the result that the purchasing power of the monetary unit must decline still further. Certainly, the actual money interest rate increases during the boom, but it continues to lag behind the rate which would conform to the market, i.e. the natural interest rate, augmented by the positive price premium. So long as this situation prevails, the upswing continues. Inventories of goods are readily sold, prices and profits rise. Business enterprises are overwhelmed with orders because everyone anticipates further price increases, and workers find employment at increasing wage rates. However, this situation cannot last forever. Number 5, malinvestment of available capital goods. The natural interest rate is established at that height which tends toward equilibrium on the market. The tendency is toward a condition where no capital goods are idle, no opportunities for starting profitable enterprises remain unexploited, and the only projects not undertaken are those which no longer yield a profit at the prevailing natural interest rate. Assume, however, that the equilibrium toward which the market is moving is disturbed by the interference of the banks. Money may be obtained below the natural interest rate. As a result, businesses may be started which weren't profitable before, and which become profitable only through the lower than natural interest rate, which appears with the expansion of circulation credit. Here again we see the difference which exists between a drop in purchasing power caused by the expansion of circulation credit and a loss of purchasing power brought about by an increase in the quantity of money. In the latter case, i.e. with an increase in the quantity of money in the narrower sense, the prices first affected are either number 1, those of consumers' goods only, or number 2, the prices of both consumers' and producers' goods. Which it will be depends on whether those first receiving the new quantities of money use this new wealth for consumption or production. However, if the decrease in purchasing power is caused by an increase in bank-created fiduciary media, then it is the prices of producers' goods which are first affected. The prices of consumers' goods follow only to the extent that wages and profits rise. Since it always requires some time for the market to reach full equilibrium, the static or natural prices, wage rates and interest rates never actually appear. The process leading to their establishment is never completed before changes occur, which once again indicate a new equilibrium. At times, even on the unhampered market, there are some unemployed workers, unsold consumers' goods, and quantities of unused factors of production, which would not exist under static equilibrium. With the revival of business and productive activity, these reserves are in demand right away. However, once they are gone, the increase in the supply of fiduciary media necessarily leads to disturbances of a special kind. In a given economic situation, the opportunities for production, which may actually be carried out, are limited by the supply of capital goods available. Roundabout methods of production can be adopted only so far as the means for subsistence exist to maintain the workers during the entire period of the expanded process. All those projects for the completion of which means are not available must be left uncompleted, even though they may appear technically feasible, that is, if one disregards the supply of capital. However, such businesses, because of the lower loan rate offered by the banks, appear for the moment to be profitable and are therefore initiated. However, the existing resources are insufficient. Sooner or later, this must become evident. Then it will become apparent that production has gone astray, that plans were drawn up in excess of the economic means available, that speculation, i.e. activity aimed at the provision of future goods, was misdirected. Number 6. Forced savings. In recent years, considerable significance has been attributed to the fact that forced savings, which may appear as a result of the drop in purchasing power that follows an increase of fiduciary media, leads to an increase in the supply of capital. The subsistence fund is made to go farther due to the fact that, number 1, the workers consume less because wage rates tend to lag behind the rise in the prices of commodities. And number 2, those who reap the advantage of this reduction in the workers' incomes save at least a part of their gain. Whether forced savings actually appear depends, as noted above, on the circumstances in each case. There is no need to go into this any further. Nevertheless, establishing the existence of forced savings does not mean that bank expansion of circulation credit does not lead to the initiation of more roundabout production than available capabilities would warrant. To prove that, one must be able to show that the banks are only in a position to depress the money interest rate and expand the issue of a fiduciary media to the extent that the natural interest rate declines as a result of forced savings. This assumption is simply absurd, and there is no point in arguing it further. It is almost inconceivable that anyone should want to maintain it. What concerns us is the problem brought about by the banks in reducing the money rate of interest below the natural rate. For our problem, it is immaterial how much the natural interest rate may also decline under certain circumstances and within narrow limits, as a result of this action by the bank. No one doubts that forced savings can reduce the natural interest rate only fractionally, as compared with the reduction in the money interest rate which produces the forced savings. The resources which are claimed for the newly initiated longer time-consuming methods of production are unavailable for those processes where they would otherwise have been put to use. The reduction in the loan rate benefits all producers, so that all producers are now in a position to pay higher wage rates and higher prices for the material factors of production. Their competition drives up wage rates and the prices of the other factors of production. Still, except for the possibilities already discussed, this does not increase the size of the labor force or the supply of available goods of the higher order. The means of subsistence are not sufficient to provide for the workers during the extended period of production. It becomes apparent that the proposal for the new, longer, roundabout production was not adjusted with a view to the actual capital situation. For one thing, the enterprises realize that the resources available to them are not sufficient to continue their operations. They find that money is scarce. That is precisely what has happened. The general increase in prices means that all businesses need more funds than had been anticipated at their launching. More resources are required to complete them. However, the increased quantity of fiduciary media loaned out by the banks is already exhausted. The banks can no longer make additional loans at the same interest rates. As a result, they must raise the loan rate once more for 2 reasons. In the first place, the appearance of the positive price premium forces them to pay higher interest for outside funds, which they borrow. Then also, they must discriminate among the many applicants for credit. Not all enterprises can afford this increased interest rate. Those which cannot run into difficulties. Number 7, a habit-forming policy. Now, in extending circulation credit, the banks do not proceed by pumping a limited dosage of new fiduciary media into circulation and then stop. They expand the fiduciary media continuously for some time, sending, so to speak, after the first offering, a second, third, fourth, and so on. They do not simply undercut the natural interest rate once, and then adjust promptly to the new situation. Instead, they continue the practice of making loans below the natural interest rate for some time. To be sure, the increasing volume of demands on them for credit may cause them to raise the money rate of interest. Yet, even if the banks revert to the former natural rate, the rate which prevailed before their credit expansion affected the market, They still lag behind the rate which would now exist on the market if they were not continuing to expand credit. This is because a positive price premium must now be included in the new natural rate. With the help of this new quantity of fiduciary media, the banks now take care of the businessman's intensified demand for credit. Thus, the crisis does not appear yet. The enterprises using more roundabout methods of production, which have been started, are continued. Because prices rise still further, the earlier calculations of the entrepreneurs are realized. They make profits. In short, the boom continues. Number 8. The inevitable crisis and cycle. The crisis breaks out only when the banks alter their conduct to the extent that they discontinue issuing any more new fiduciary media and stop undercutting the natural interest rate. They may even take steps to restrict circulation credit. When they actually do this and why is still to be examined. First of all, however, we must ask ourselves whether it is possible for the banks to stay on the course upon which they have embarked, permitting new quantities of fiduciary media to flow into circulation continuously, and proceeding always to make loans below the rate of interest, which would prevail on the market in the absence of their interference with newly created fiduciary media. If the banks could proceed in this manner with business improving continually, could they then provide for lasting good times? Would they then be able to make the boom eternal? They cannot do this. The reason they cannot is that inflationism carried on ad infinitum is not a workable policy. If the issue of fiduciary media is expanded continuously, prices rise ever higher, and at the same time the positive price premium also rises. We shall disregard the fact that consideration for, number 1, the continually declining monetary reserves relative to fiduciary media, and number 2, the bank's operating costs must sooner or later compel them to discontinue the further expansion of circulation credit. It is precisely because and only because no end to the prolonged flood of expanding fiduciary media is foreseen that it leads to still sharper price increases and finally to a panic in which prices and the loan rate move erratically upward. Suppose the banks still did not want to give up the race. Suppose, in order to depress the loan rate, they wanted to satisfy the continuously expanding desire for credit by issuing still more circulation credit. Then they would only hasten the end, the collapse of the entire system of fiduciary media. The inflation can continue only so long as the conviction persists that it will one day cease. Once people are persuaded that the inflation will not stop, they turn from the use of this money. They flee then to real values, foreign money, the precious metals, and barter. Sooner or later, the crisis must inevitably break out as the result of a change in the conduct of the banks. The later the crack-up comes, the longer the period in which the calculation of the entrepreneurs is misguided by the issue of additional fiduciary media. The greater this additional quantity of fiduciary money, the more factors of production have been firmly committed in the form of investments, which appeared profitable only because of the artificially reduced interest rate, and which proved to be unprofitable now that the interest rate has again been raised. Great losses are sustained as a result of misdirected capital investments. Many new structures remain unfinished. Others already completed close down operations. Still others are carried on because, after writing off losses, which represent a waste of capital, operation of the existing structure pays at least something. The crisis, with its unique characteristics, is followed by stagnation. The misguided enterprises and businesses of the boom period are already liquidated. Bankruptcy and adjustment have cleared up the situation. The banks have become cautious. They fight shy of expanding circulation credit. They are not inclined to give an ear to credit applications from schemers and promoters. Not only is the artificial stimulus to business through the expansion of circulation credit lacking, but even businesses which would be feasible, considering the capital goods available, are not attempted because the general feeling of discouragement makes every innovation appear doubtful. Prevailing money interest rates fall below the natural interest rates. When the crisis breaks out, loan rates bound sharply upward because threatened enterprises offer extremely high interest rates for the funds to acquire the resources, with the help of which they hope to save themselves. Later, as the panic subsides, a situation develops as a result of the restriction of circulation credit, and attempts to dispose of large inventories, causing prices and the money interest rate to fall steadily and leading to the appearance of a negative price premium. This reduced rate of loan interest is adhered to for some time, even after the decline in prices comes to a standstill, when a negative price premium no longer corresponds to conditions. Thus, it comes about that the money interest rate is lower than the natural rate. Yet, because the unfortunate experiences of the recent crisis have made everyone uneasy, the incentive to business activity is not as strong as circumstances would otherwise warrant. Quite a time passes before capital funds, increased once again by savings accumulated in the meantime, exert sufficient pressure on the loan interest rate for an expansion of entrepreneurial activity to resume. With this development, the low point is passed and the new boom begins.